So we're going to move on and talk about statements of responsibility. ACR 2, as you know, told us that if you have a statement of responsibility taken from outside the chief source of information, it had to be enclosed in square brackets to indicate that. In RDA, only a statement of responsibility taken from a source outside of the resource itself will be enclosed in square brackets. So we're going to do a lot less bracketing in RDA records. So you can see in this record, and I'm so grateful to Mary for printing out your slides in color, because you can actually see it in what you take home, the changes that I'm trying to indicate, which a black and white wouldn't indicate. So we would have bracketed this statement of responsibility that came from the verso of the title page. But in RDA, you can take them from anywhere in the resource itself without putting them in brackets. And you can take them from multiple places in the resource. Another thing that's changed with RDA is our cherished rule of 3, or hated rule of 3, depending on how you feel about it. When you had a statement of responsibility that named more than 3 persons or corporate bodies in a row, we were told to only give the first and replace the rest by the mark of omission followed by the bracketed Latin et al. First of all, RDA doesn't like Latin, so we know we're not going to do Latin in RDA. But basically, RDA says transcribe what you see. So the basic default is if you have 4 authors in your statement of responsibility or 35 authors in your statement of responsibility, RDA says take what you see and transcribe it. So now RDA gives you an out. There is an alternative here. But the basic rule is transcribe what you see. The other thing you'll see on this, what happened here? Oh.
HP is trying to help you.
Oh, thanks HP. Okay.
I don't like its help either.
Okay. So the other thing you'll see on this slide is that I changed the first indicator. And that reflects a change in the way we're going to name works in RDA. So we'll talk about this later, hopefully I'll get to it. But there's no longer the rule of 3 for what in ACR 2 we would have called main entry, right? And the main entry would have been the first of 3, but if you had 4, you go to title main entry. In RDA, when you have multiple creators, it doesn't matter how many they are. If you have a principal creator, if you know who the principal creator is, that person or corporate body or family, which is new in RDA, becomes the 100, the 1XX, even if there's 4 of them. If there is no principal person that's identified, principal entity, then the very first named one in the list becomes the principal, what the authorized access point, which is how we will name the work in RDA. So RDA is really concerned about naming works that you're cataloging. And in ACR 2, if we named this work, it would have been a title work. Wouldn't have been named by author title. In RDA, even though there are 4 authors, we'll have an author title entry for this particular work. And the 100 field would be for Markey, Sean Markey. There is an alternative in RDA in 2415 that has an optional omission that says if you have a statement of responsibility that names more than 3 persons, families, or corporate bodies performing the same function or with the same degree of responsibility, you can omit any but the first of each group of such persons, families, or corporate bodies and indicate the omission by summarizing what has been omitted in a language and script preferred by the agency doing the cataloging. And you indicate that the summary was taken from outside a resource because you're supplying the summary by putting it by some means, and that means is the square brackets in this case. So instead of saying all 4 authors, you can in RDA apply the optional omission and say Sean Markey and 3 others. But you're not limited to that in RDA, actually. You'll see that you could say, well, you always must give the first name in the statement. That's required. But you could say, well, I'm going to omit Mr. Pierce, but Mr. Bothmann is a professor at my college, and I really need to include his name. So RDA actually allows you to do things like the second example here, which would be Sean Markey, Kelly Bothmann, and 2 others. So you always must include the first name, but then you can omit other names. Now, the Library of Congress and the Program for Cooperative Cataloging policy statement for this omission says generally do not omit any of the names. So most of the large libraries in the PCC, most of the big universities and other libraries, they're going to transcribe all of the names as found. I had one recently where there were about 15 names, and I finally gave in to recording them all and said something like, I gave the first name and 14 others, or however many names there were, because I just did not, there's a time element involved as well. Now, if you're cutting and pasting out of a PDF, right, if you have a PDF, there's no extra time really involved in transcribing all the names. But I think, so that the policy is generally give everything, use your judgment about when you want to omit some of the names. The other change in statement of responsibility is that the basic rule again applies in that you transcribe what you see in RDA. In ACR2, we were told to drop off all these little words around the names. So we were told only include titles and abbreviations of titles of nobility and address and honor and other things, and there was certain categories in RDA, in ACR2, 1.1F7. But otherwise to omit all this stuff that preceded or followed names. But in RDA, the basic instruction is to transcribe what you see. So if it says, forward by the late Dr. Leon Goldman, we'll actually record all of that. Or if by the Reverend R.M. Dickey, we'll record by the Reverend, include that in the statement of responsibility. There is also in this instruction in RDA an optional omission that says you can abridge a statement of responsibility, but only if this can be done without loss of essential information. Do not use a mark of omission to indicate such an omission. Always record the first name appearing in the statement, and omitting it, and then of course if you're going to omit multiple names, then it refers you to that instruction that we just looked at in the previous slide. But so RDA actually would allow you to just say forward by Leon Goldman or by R.M. Dickey. It allows you to omit inessential information, but the basic instruction is to record everything you see. And the Library of Congress PCC policy statement for this also says generally do not abridge a statement of responsibility. We have a slight change in statements of responsibility that consist of noun phrases. So in ACR2, if it was indicative of the nature of a work, a noun phrase was treated as other title information. But if it was indicative of the role of the persons or bodies named in the statement of responsibility rather than the nature of the work, it was treated as part of the statement of responsibility. And in RDA, all noun phrases are treated as part of the statement of responsibility. So this first case where we had dramatized adaptations, that's the nature of the work, and so it's other title in ACR2, but it's treated as statement of responsibility in RDA. If there's more than one statement of responsibility, only the very first statement of responsibility is required as a core element. If you record more than the first, record them in the order indicated by the sequence, layout, or topography of the source of information. And if you're not giving all the statements of responsibility, we're told to give preference to those that identify creators of intellectual or artistic content. So if the source says introduction by so-and-so and then written by so-and-so, If you're deciding if you're going to apply the core part of RDA and says only the first statement is required, you would record the one that says written by, because that's really more about, that's about the intellectual creation of the work rather than the introduction, which is an contribution to the expression of the work, but it's not the work itself. In general, I think most people are recording all of the statements of responsibility. Let's do some practice. So here, you hopefully don't look at your books because you have the answers in your book, or cover the right side of your screen, of your page. So you see, we have a title page. At the top, we have a person's name, and then we have a translation statement. What are you going to do in your 245? You actually have several options. Most of us would probably do this, right? Give the author of the book, and then which is at the top typographically, and then the statement about the translation. But it is perfectly correct in RDA to do just that, because only the first statement of responsibility is required as a core element. So if you see this in copy, it isn't wrong. It may not be as complete as you'd like, and you could choose to augment it by adding things that have been omitted, but it's not wrong in RDA. Here's another example. So you can see that the statement of responsibility has he's a knight, I guess, he's a sir, and he's got some initials that he's affiliated with, and in AACR2, we would have done just Basil Marcasinus, but in RDA we'll say Sir Basil Marcasinus, comma QC, comma FBA, in cooperation with. So basically the default is transcribe all of the statement of responsibility. You have the option to omit inessential information, so you could drop off Sir, you could drop off those initials, and it would be still valid RDA. So if you see that in copy, it's not wrong. They've just exercised the option to omit some of that inessential information. If we look at this one, here we have some capitalization going on in our title, and we've got 5 authors. So you actually have lots of different possible correct ways to create this in your MARC record. So this is what I would do, which is following the Appendix A in RDA for punctuation and capitalization, and I would transcribe all 5 of the authors. But it would be perfectly okay to do this, which is to capitalize the word Israel the way it appears on the book, and to give the first name person and say, and 4 others. Or even, you could say, the first name person and the third name person and 3 others. And notice, in one example I spelled out the word 4, in another example I used the number 3. There is no correct way. Both of them are perfectly okay in RDA, and you'll see examples in the text of RDA that shows both of these types. And there are many other possibilities as well, right? Because you could do Guy Ben Parat, Yagil Levi, Ari Naor, and 2 others. I mean, you can pick and choose. I'd like to think that most of us would just transcribe all the names, and then we will all get the same result in our catalogs. But RDA gives you options. Now, how about this one? So you've got an editor, and you've got, I think, 15 authors. What this turns out to be is a compilation of chapters of different essays by different authors. So this is not a case where 14 or 15 authors wrote one book, wrote like everything together. So this is actually going to be the work is not named by author title. So it's not a case where we're going to have a 100 for Mr. Adams, or for Adams Thomas L. That will not be a 100. So this is an edited compilation, so it will be entered, it will be named by its title, just like it is in ACR2. So you have a variety of possibilities of statements of responsibility as well. So you could just take the first statement of responsibility, which is the editor. You could do the second case, which is to give all the authors' names. Or you could do something like the editor followed by the first author and 14 others. This is a case where I wouldn't feel that terrible if a cataloger chose that last option. I think that would be okay.
The president's son that's on the
Right, yeah. So you choose, sometimes you have to make political decisions about what names you're going to put on. The other thing I wanted to point out, which I didn't mention, is that whether you choose to give all the names or some of the names does not have any direct connection between whether you make access points in your bib record for those names. So you could do all 5 of these names and only use the first name because it's required, because he's the first named creator. So that would be a 100, and you could have no 700s. I don't like that choice, but RDA allows it. You could also do my second option, which is the first name and 4 others, and give 5 access points for all of the people. So the statement of responsibility is not tied to your access points anymore. They don't have to be justified in the same, more strict way that we tried to do in ACR2. The reason is because we have relationship designators that we can use with those names. So even if we said Guy, Ben Perrott, and 4 others, we could also have an added entry, a 700, that says Mizrahi Shlomo and subfield E author. And that tells the catalog user that this person, his relationship to this work is as an author. So we don't have to have it in the statement of responsibility because we have these designators that go into the subfield E of our 7XX and 1XX fields. And we'll hopefully get to that later. So one more example. So here we have a mix of capitalization, and look at its statement of responsibility by the Reverend J.E. Hanauer, and lots of text below his name. This is what I would do, which is what we probably would have done in AHR2. I would just use regular capitalization, and I would just include by the Reverend, because I think that's important identifying information. But some people would do this, which is the kitchen sink, right? And it is perfectly valid in RDA. You could choose to capitalize the way it appears, or not, but you could choose to give all of the text that's associated with the statement of responsibility, which is the person's affiliations. Either one of these is correct. I hesitate to say one is more correct than the other. They're both equally correct. And having all that information that appears after the person's name is potentially informative, right, to our users, or helps identify this particular person who might, particularly if it was J.E. Smith, it might be more helpful to identify who this particular Smith was compared to there's probably other Reverend J.E. Smiths. So it's kind of a judgment call as to how much time you want to put into typing all this out, whether you can capture it electronically. In some cases, if you're digitizing an old collection, it may be possible to take your scan and capture all this, and then you're just going to throw it in because it's easier that way. Some catalogers, you've seen copy and OCLC from PCC libraries that are doing both of these things, both of these options. And the policy statement, as I mentioned, was generally do not abridge a statement of responsibility, which would generally mean you would record everything you have that is associated with the name. And then we have a case like this, and this is a very common case, right, where you have academics and it lists what university they're at or their title and so on. And we have a variety of options. I like the first one the best. This is what I would do. But many people are including the affiliations, and you end up with a long statement of responsibility. It's hard to read. And there was some discussion on the RDA list just last week, and I think previously as well, that suggested that since RDA allows you to supply punctuation that's missing for legibility, instead of just separating all these things by commas, how about putting the affiliations in parentheses? And I like that idea. I think that would make that much more legible. So I think if I do decide that there are times where I want to include the affiliations, I'm going to most likely adopt that option of changing the punctuation a little bit for legibility. And here's our Ukrainian folk tales, and you can see on the title page we have one statement of responsibility, but on the verso we have 2 additional statements of responsibility. This is what I would do, and notice the main thing is that you don't have to bracket any of it like you did in ACR2. It's also possible that you could decide to give just one statement, because only one is core, and then you have to decide which is the most pertinent to the intellectual or artistic content of the work. And I would have decided that these apparently are like anonymous. They must be like anonymous folk tales, so that the translation is probably, to me, more important than who compiled them. But you might decide, okay, I think the compiler is more important. But I think that, from my mind, if I'm only giving one statement, I would give the translation in this case. Okay, moving right along, past Area 1. So you're now all experts in cataloging title and statement of responsibility in RDA. And now we're going to move to Area 2 of ACR2. Of course, there's no such areas in RDA. So addition statement. The main thing I want to stress with addition statement is you take what you see. You don't abbreviate anything anymore, but if something is abbreviated, you record it in its abbreviated form. So if the source of information says spelled out in words, second edition, in RDA, that's what you're going to record. Second example is a French version of that, Nouvelle Edition. If there's a Roman numeral, in RDA we transcribe the numbers as they appear. So we will give the Roman numeral, even though in ACR2 we transformed it into an Arabic numeral. On the fourth example, just as an illustration that if you have an abbreviation on the piece, you record that and you don't change it in any way. So in this is a German sechste Auflage, but you give 6 period and then Auflage. Now I show also the extra period here, but you won't do that anymore. I probably should change that, because the Library of Congress says if that 250 field ends in a period, that's good enough. If it doesn't, add a period. Our ACR2 had instructions on what to do with the inaccuracies in addition statements. So there were cases where we were allowed to correct an inaccuracy by using brackets. RDA, as you know already, does not let us make corrections in brackets. So if we need to note that something is a typo or an error, we have to do it another way, which is generally to give a note. So for example, the first example I have here, second edition is spelled out in the book, but edition has a misspelling in it. That didn't affect us in ACR2 because we abbreviated the word edition to ED period, so we didn't even give any indication in the record that there was a typo. Since we're recording what we see in RDA, we're going to record the typo as it appears. Now, what does this mean? It means that when you're looking at a record, you can't know if the cataloger just made a typo when they were keying it in, or if you have to trust that it was keyed in correctly. Because in this case, you might decide I don't need to make a note that the word addition is spelled wrong. You could, and then we'd all know for sure that you weren't making the mistake in your 250 if you put a 500 note. And so, maybe we don't have best practices for this yet. It's still pretty early. Maybe it would be good to put a note that says addition statement has misspelling on piece or on the item. The second case is much more clear where you do need a note. And I don't really love the result in RDA because you're transcribing the addition statement as it appears. So it says 4th edition, but it's actually the 5th edition. So in your 250, you're going to have 4th edition, and then you can make a note. But in your displays, right, what's going to come up early is so I don't like it. But then again, if you pick the book off the shelf, it says 4th edition. You really don't know that it's the 5th edition, right? A user may not have any clue if they're actually just using the book. So we're kind of just representing the book the way it represents itself, and then alerting users to any errors that might be in that representation. And then a little bit about bracketing. It is actually still allowed in one area of RDA when you need to supply the actual addition statement word, if that doesn't occur on the piece. In the first example, we were told to change something that appeared in symbols to a word, a phrase describing the symbols in ACR2. So we would have had bracket 3 asterisks addition. In RDA, since we can typographically transcribe exactly what appears in this case, we would just have 3 asterisks followed by the word addition. But in the next 3 examples, there is no actual addition word on the piece. And so both AACR2 and RDA allow you to supply this, but we wouldn't use abbreviations in RDA. So that's the main difference there. And this is a change from when RDA originally came out a couple of years ago. We now have an explicit rule that says basically what we were doing in AACR2 basically allows us to do it in RDA, which says if it's lacking an addition statement, but it's known to contain significant changes from other additions, if considered important for identification or access, we can supply an addition statement. Since we're supplying it, we have to indicate that it's coming from outside the resource in one of 2 ways. The simplest way is to put brackets around it. So again, the only difference would be we wouldn't use abbreviations. So we would use spelled out forms of these supplied words. The other way, if you didn't use brackets, would be to put a note that says addition statement supplied by cataloger or something like that. How many of you know that the 250 field is now repeatable? This just got approved at the last ALA, I think. It has not actually been implemented in OCLC yet, but I expect in their next MARC update that will be possible to do. And one of the reasons to do this was that sometimes you have a resource that has multiple addition statements, and it was kind of confusing how to actually put that into the record. You use a comma separating one from the other. Now we have the ability we will soon have the ability to repeat the 250 field. We will also have the ability to use that subfield 3 for material specified. So if the addition statement does not, for example, for a multi-part item, excuse me, for a multi-part resource or a serial, if there's an addition statement or the addition statement varies from volume to volume, you can use the subfield 3 to say this addition statement is on volumes 1 to 2, and this addition statement is on volumes 3 to 5. Or for a serial, you can say from 2005 to 2010, it had this addition statement, and from 2011 on, it had a different addition statement. Excuse me. I was fine until just now. So again, look for that change coming soon. I'm not sure when, though. The cold is long over, but the cough remains sometimes. Okay, 264 field. We know in new RDA records we will not be using 260 field anymore. We have a new field, 264, which is used for 4 different things: production, publication, distribution, manufacture, actually 5 things, and copyright statements. So each of those things in RDA is a different element. So production information, and when we say production in this case, it refers to the production of unpublished resources. So not motion picture production, or not record production like recording producers and things like that. Production in this sense is unpublished. So very rarely will you probably need to use it, unless you're cataloging archival materials or rocks or special collections materials perhaps, or manuscripts. So we're mostly going to use it for publication, distribution, manufacture, and when manufacture refers specifically to published things. So for example, the printers of a book, or the manufacturers of a CD. And finally, copyright statement. And just like we had in the 260, we have 2 indicators. The first indicator is the same as it is in 260, and that is the sequence of statements. So the field is repeatable, and if you have changes over time in the publication information, you can use an indicator to say that this particular bit of data applies to the earliest part of the resource, and this is intervening, and this is the current or latest issues. The second indicator now describes the function of the entity. So value 0 will be used for production, value 1 for publication, 2 for distribution, 3 for manufacture, and 4 will only be used for the copyright, and only the copyright date goes into that if you're using that for copyright. So the basic guidelines are always use a 264 for all new, original, or for if you're upgrading records to RDA, you can change the 260 to 264. But for all original records, you should be using a 264. In the very early days of RDA rollout, during the testing period, we didn't have this field yet in MARC. So you will see RDA-coded records with 260s in them. And that was all we had in for a while. So those are okay. But they can be changed if you want to 264. Oh, I wasn't keeping up, was I? Sorry about that. Yell at me if I haven't changed the slide in a while. Okay, so the subfields in the 264 field are basically the same as we had in the 260. So you have the A is the place, the B is the name of the particular entity, and C is the date. And so whether it's place of production or publication or distribution, the meaning is defined by that indicator value, that second indicator value that you use. The PCC has developed some guidelines on how to use these 264s, and I recommend you going there and pulling those down, printing them up. They're not too long, and keep them handy, because those will really help. And they have some nice examples. So let's look at some examples of publication, distribution, etc., and the changes from ACR2 to RDA. The basic change, again, is you transcribe what is found on the resource. So we're no longer going to turn places into abbreviations by going to an appendix. We no longer are instructed in RDA to do that. So if it says Vancouver, British Columbia, we're going to transcribe it as Vancouver, British Columbia. If it says Department of Geography, spelled out, we're going to no longer abbreviate any of those words. So Victoria, British Columbia, Canada gets transcribed in full, and Department of Geography gets transcribed with the full spelled out words. And there were other cases where ACR2 said to go for it told us to shorten the name of publishers into an internationally understood form, and there were certain words where we were told to apply abbreviations out of Appendix B in ACR2. So this is an example of of applying that in ACR2. So we had something called Open Hand Publishing Inc. So ACR2 said, shorten that, drop off the ink because you don't need that. The word publishing was in the appendix, and we were supposed to abbreviate that as PUB. So we would drop that off. Seattle, Washington got abbreviated to WASH, right? Seattle Wash. And then the distributor is the Tallman Company Inc. And we would have dropped off the initial article. We would abbreviate the word company to CO because that's also in the appendix. And we would have dropped off Inc. In RDA, we just give everything. But you notice that we now will have, if you give both of the statements, they go into two separate 264 fields. Excuse me. So the second indicator 1 is the name of the publisher, place of the publishing, date of the publication. And the second indicator 2 is the distribution information. And the second indicator 4 is the copyright information. Now, if you have recorded, if you've recorded the name, the place of publication, excuse me, wish I could quickly flip a switch when I'm going to cough. Yeah, that might help. Thanks. If you've recorded the place of publication, the publisher's name, and the date of publication, those are core elements, and none of the rest of them are required. So giving the distribution information is only a core element if you don't have the corresponding publication information. And giving the copyright date is only a core element if you have neither the date of publication nor the date of distribution. Only at that point are you required to give the copyright date. Notice the difference as well. So you see in the ACR2 we had a subfield C, copyright 1991. Copyright date was allowed to substitute for a date of publication. That's not the case in RDA. You must give an actual date of publication, and if you don't have one on the piece, you guess one. You give a probable one, unless you absolutely can't. But most cases you can, if you have a copyright date, you can usually guess that the date of publication is the same year. And we have elaborate instructions in policy statements that tell us what to do in many cases, so not to worry. So this slide is just illustrating that if the source of information has an abbreviation in it, you transcribe it the way it appears. So if it says Vancouver, BC, you record BC. ACR2 also allowed us to give corrections in this area in brackets, and we can't do that in RDA. So it says Stockholm, but it's actually in Paris, that we know it's published in Paris. We were able to correct that in the 260. In RDA, we'll actually have to give a note. Now, in your fixed field, you'll code the country of publication as being in France, even though the 264 says Stockholm. And other cases where the abbreviation might not be clear, ACR2 allowed us to add a bracket to explain it. And again, you can't do that. You transcribe what you see. And if you need to explain what BSAS is, you'd give it in a note. And if the word is thought not to be understood because it's in a language that your users might not know, ACR2 allowed us to add a bracket with the English form of the name. So this Welsh name for Cardiff was on the piece, and we were allowed to supply the English name. We can't do that in RDA. We give it as found. If it's necessary for explanation or identification, you give a note. And the same thing when you have a shortened form of a name, like if it just says Rio, we were allowed to add De Janeiro, and we're not going to do that. One thing that we can carry over from AACR2, this was not in the initial release of RDA, but they did change it and accept a rule revision proposal. We are allowed now to add in brackets the bigger place in which a place is located if it's considered important for identification. So it's an optional addition to add the bigger place, but we will no longer use abbreviations, right? So if you're going to say London, it's the London that's in Ontario, you're going to spell out the province. So you have three options in this case in RDA. You can just say London and not give an explanation. You could say London and then bracket the bigger place like Ontario. Or you could give it as it's found in the piece and give a note that says 500, published in London, Ontario. And remember we had this rule that dealt with the country of the home agency doing the cataloging and whether you recorded all the places or certain places of publication. RDA has kind of solved this problem of the fact that it makes it hard to share records among different countries. Because in AACR2, we would always record the first place, and then if a place was in your country, you were also supposed to record that, but you could omit the others. So that meant that a Canadian library, a British library, and an American library, for cataloging the exact same book, might come up with 3 different 260s, because the places are in all 3 countries and they might not record all of them. In RDA, the basic instruction is to record all of the places or just the first place. So you have an option. Most people are probably going to record just the first place, but depending on, it doesn't matter whether you're in Britain, Canada, or the US, if you record just the first place or all 3 of the places, you end up with an exact same record. So we can share it more easily, and we don't necessarily have to change in a copy. I don't think very many people would have bothered to change it, but technically they should have, to make it conform to the places from your country. So as you can see here, Canadian Library in AACR2 would have just done Toronto. In RDA they can do Toronto, Buffalo, London, or just Toronto. An American library would have done in AACR2 Toronto and Buffalo, but omitted London. But in RDA, you'd either do the same thing that the Canadian library did, Toronto, Buffalo, London, or just Toronto. Either one's okay, and it's identical. And the British library would have done in AACR2 Toronto and London, but again, in RDA, we get the same results, whether you choose to give all 3 or just the first. So it makes record sharing a lot easier. Okay. A little bit about, and this is one of the most complicated areas of RDA, and takes a while to understand, but I think eventually you can, it becomes easy to understand. So the core elements for a published resource, which is most of what we catalog, for most of us. So place of publication, publisher's name, and date of publication are core elements. Therefore, you must supply all of those elements. You must put something into the MARC record in the 264 with a second indicator value of 1. You must have that field for a book or anything published. And if you don't know what goes, if you don't have that bit of information on the resource, then you're going to have to say something like we did in Latin in AACR2, where we said SL, or we guessed, or we made a probable guess. You'll have to do all of that. Particularly, this is really important with dates, because so for a date of publication, or a probable date of publication, or this phrase right out of RDA, date of publication not identified, which we consider to be a very last resort, must always be recorded in RDA. But so must a place or a bracketed guess of a place, or the phrase place of publication not identified used. Copyright date is a separate element in RDA. It doesn't substitute for a publication date like it did in AACR2. And copyright date, as I said before, is a core element if neither the date of publication nor the date of distribution is identified in your record. In other words, if you've had to record date of publication not identified, date of distribution not identified, and you know the copyright date, then it's core. The other thing is, as we mentioned, is if you have more than one place of publication or publisher's name as well, only the first recorded is required. Now, there is a policy statement from Library of Congress and PCC that says supply a probable place of publication if possible, rather than recording place of publication not identified. And in most cases, you can at least guesstimate up to the level of a country. But here are some examples right out of AACR2. Actually, no, I'm not sure they're right out of AACR2, but they're real-life examples in AACR2 showing what they would look like in RDA. In the first case, if you have absolutely no idea where the place of publication was, you would record the phrase place of publication not identified in brackets. If you can guess that this is Great Britain or Canada or California or Illinois or something like that, you would prefer to do that. Put it in brackets instead of place of publication not identified. The reason for that is that if you can put something in there other than not identified, then you're not required to go down one further level to the distributor information if you have it. So it's one of my colleagues called it the cascading vortex of hell or something like that. So you always want to try to fill in the information in the publication information so you don't have to go down to the next level of distribution. And if you can't fill the distribution information and you have the manufacturing information, then that becomes a core element. So you try to avoid that by giving full information in the publication area. In the second case, in this example, we don't use SN anymore. And if you absolutely have no way to give a probable publisher, then you'd have to say publisher not identified. In a questionable date, we still have the questionable place. We can still use questionable places, but you can see that if you're doing that, you use separate brackets around each bit instead of one set of brackets. And that last example shows that as well. We have an LCPCC practice that says supply a probable place of publication if possible. And there's various ways that RDA says you can do that. So you can, if you know the place, you're allowed to supply it, but since you're supplying it from outside the resource, you put it in brackets. So you know it's Chicago, you just say bracket Chicago. You could also do bracket Chicago, comma, Illinois. That would be perfectly okay too. If you have a probable place, in other words, you think it's Chicago, you can add a question mark, just like we could in ACR2. So you think it's Chicago, bracket Chicago question mark. If you know it's in Illinois, but you're not sure, you think it's probably Chicago, but you're not sure of the local place, but you absolutely know that it was published in Illinois, you have the option of putting a question mark in front of the smaller place. And then in the last example here is you think it's Chicago, Illinois, but it could be Milwaukee, you don't know. So the question mark, in fact, this first example with Chicago question mark and that example with Chicago, Illinois question mark, they mean the same thing in this case. It's just that if you're adding the larger place, the name of the larger place, and you don't know for sure it's in that larger place, the question mark goes at the end. You also have the option of just giving a known country, state, province, etc. So if you know it's Illinois but you don't know where, you could just say bracket Illinois. Or if you think it's likely Illinois but you're not sure, you can also say Illinois question mark, which could mean that it's from Wisconsin. But okay. Now, distribution is one of those core if elements. So distribution information becomes core if the equivalent publication bit has not been identified. So you try to avoid this, because you save yourself recording stuff that maybe isn't that important if you can give publication information. You're always free to give as much information as you know, though. If you know the publisher and the distributor and the manufacturer, it's perfectly correct to record all of that information. It's just not required, and it may not be necessary. So just like with publication information, if you have more than one place of distribution or more than one distributor's name, only the first is required to be recorded. And there's a policy statement that says that Library of Congress practice is that if you're giving distribution data elements in lieu of missing publication data elements, give the complete distribution statement rather than just the one missing element. And we'll look at some examples here showing what they mean by that. So here is an example where on the source it says ABC Publishers 2009. So we don't know where ABC Publishers is located. It doesn't say. And it says distributed by Iverson Company, Seattle. So unless you can guess that ABC Publishers is in the United States or is in Illinois or Chicago, if you don't feel comfortable making that kind of guess, you're stuck with place of publication not identified in brackets. At that point, if you know the place of distribution, it becomes a core element. And so in this case, we do know that the place of distribution is Seattle. That's the only thing missing out of the first 264. The other things we've filled in. So only Seattle is core. And so what you see here in this MARC record is perfectly valid. But the Library of Congress has said if you're giving any one of the bits of the distribution element, give it all, because it will be more useful and more informative. So Library of Congress would do Seattle space colon space subfield B Iverson Company. So, I mean, you could adopt the Library of Congress policy. The PCC has not adopted it because it's an LC policy only. So the PCC is leaving it to cataloger judgment. The second example is just a similar one, showing that you can actually, all it says on the piece is Australia. It doesn't give us a local place or even a state within Australia, but we can just use Australia. And again, but Library of Congress would say Australia, and then they would say space colon space subfield B Goodman Limited. It would be better in either of these cases if in the first case we could guess that it was United States. We could even say United States question mark, right? Then we wouldn't need that second 264. It wouldn't be required. The same thing with the second example. If we could maybe say Australia question mark as the place of publication, then we wouldn't need the second 264. It's no longer core elements. The same thing happens with the names of publishers. So here we have on the title page it says Chicago 2009. On the verso it says RD Distributors Evanston. So what do we know? We don't know the name of the publisher. We have the place of publication. We have the year. We also know the name of the distributor and the place of distribution, but not the year of distribution. So unless we can figure out the publisher's name from somewhere outside the resource, then we could put it in brackets. But if we can't, we have to say publisher not identified. At that point, the name of the distributor, if it's known to us, becomes a core element. So all that is required by RDA would be a second 264 with a subfield B for the name of the distributor. But it looks kind of odd sitting there just in a subfield B. So again, the LC policy is if you're going to give one bit of distribution information, give all that you have. So they would do Evanston in subfield A followed by RD distributors. And the second example is very kind of similar case where you have neither the place of publication nor the publisher, but you know the name, place of distribution and the name of the distributor, so you would give both of those. In this case, only the first recorded is required, so only Boston has been required, but you could also do semicolon subfield A, repeatable subfield A for Ottawa. That would be correct as well. And then here's a date of distribution examples. So on the title page, you have the name of the publisher, the place of publication, but you don't have the date of publication. But on the Verso, all you have is a distribution date. So strictly following RDA, you would have the place of publication, the publisher's name, and this is the abbreviations as found on the piece. So if it's found abbreviations, you record the abbreviations. And then finally, you'd have to have date of publication not identified. And that causes you to be required to record the distribution date if you know it. So you could just do a second 264 with a $C 2009. Again, Elsie says, give a full distribution statement if you're supplying one bit of it. And in this case, that would mean you would, since we don't know the place of distribution or the name of the distributor, we'd have to say bracket place of distribution not identified, colon, distributor not identified, and then 2009. You could avoid all that by guessing the date of publication and putting it in that first 264. So if the best you can do is say, well, it's distributed in 2009, I bet it was published in 2009, I'll say 2009 question mark. Then you could skip all the rest. So it always pays to try to supply something rather than saying not identified in the publication statement. In the interest of time, I'm going to move forward, but it's basically the same thing with manufacturing. So if you don't have the publication information and you don't have the distribution information, but you do have the manufacturing information, then you're going to record that. So it's the same kind of principle of cascading down through these various bits of information. But I'm going to skip over that. You can look at those on your own. And I'm going to go over to copyright date, because you're going to need that for sure. So copyright date is a core element if neither the date of publication nor the date of distribution is identified. But they're not required for multi-part monographs, serials, and integrating resources. RDA 2.11 is the instruction. And a change from ACR 2, we're not going to use the letter C and the letter P for the phonogram copyright date. We're actually going to use the symbols. In OCLC, they're part of the diacritic special characters. So if you're using OCLC, it's easy to get the symbol. If you're using some other local system and you don't have those symbols available to you on your keyboard, then RDA does allow you to use the spelled out words copyright or phonogram, but you don't use the letter C or the letter P by themselves anymore. If you're going to record the copyright date, it goes in the 264 field with a second indicator 4, and only subfield C will be used. And there won't be an ending period in that particular subfield, in that particular 264. So there are just two examples showing a copyright date and a phonogram copyright for sound recording. If the resource has multiple copyright dates that apply to various aspects, so for example, you have a resource that includes text, sound, and graphics, and you have multiple copyright dates, RDA tells us to record any that are considered important for identification or selection. So, for example, a copyright date of a text, which is from 2010, but it has an accompanying disc that has a copyright date of 2009, you can record both of those because the 264 field is repeatable, and you can even use the subfield 3, which is the materials that, specific materials that that it applies to. So you could say that, you could also put subfield 3 in that first one, I guess, that says text, or book, or whatever you wanted to say. Or you could just add it to the second one saying that this is the copyright date applying to the disk. On the other hand, if the resource has multiple copyrights that apply to a single aspect, then RDA says record only the latest copyright date. So if you have a book and it says copyright 1988, copyright 1999, copyright 2010, copyright 2013 use the latest date. How do you deal with approximate dates of publication, distribution, etc.? If you don't actually know the date of publication specifically, you can give approximate dates. So what I have in the left-hand column here is what you would do in AACR2, and these are right out of AACR2 1.4F7 and 2.16G, and what RDA tells you to do. So if you have two dates next to each other, this or that, there's no difference. 1971 or 1972, no difference. One single date that's questionable, again, we do the same thing. We add a question mark. You can still use between dates. Now, in AACR2, a between date could only be 20 years between or less. RDA has removed that restriction. So you don't have to have, it could be between 1980 and 2013. And that's perfectly fine in RDA. We don't like abbreviations in Latin, so circa has gone away, and they've decided to use, instead of using approximately, which they have used in other places in RDA, they're using a question mark here. So it's more like a probable date. 1960 maybe, circa, around 1960. So that you use a question mark there. For the where you would substitute a hyphen for a digit to represent a decade or a century, you would use between dates in RDA. So for the 1970s, you would say between 1970 and 1979. If it was, you think it was the 1970s, but it's questionable, you're not sure, you add a question mark. So between 1970 and 1979, question mark. For century dates, again, you give the whole range of years. And also, you can now, actually, we had this in AACR2 as well, but it was only restricted to special materials like manuscripts. But you can say things like not after or not before, and then you can give a specific date if you have it, but you could also say not after 2012. I mean, you could be more generic than just a very specific date. If you have, so those are ways of giving approximate dates, supplying a date and avoiding that cascading vortex of terror or horror. If you don't have the ability to guess anything, then you're forced. I mean, there are times where you may not be able to give a date. I mean, I think in most cases you could probably give a century date as a question mark, right? I mean, between 1900 and 1999, or I mean, most cases you should be able to do something. But if you don't feel, oh, we're beeping. I'm not sure how to turn your.
Running your triathlon.
So if you're absolutely unable to give a date of publication, then you can give, as you see in the examples, date of publication not identified or date of distribution not identified. And then the copyright dates become, if you have them, you would be required to record them. So C 1967, of course, would become the copyright symbol 1967. Or if you have to, you can spell out the word copyright, or you can spell out the phonogram. So let's look at this in some real-life examples, how this plays out. And this is a very straightforward example. In AACR2, you have a university press, and all you have is the copyright date. So in AACR2, we would have had a 260. We would have substituted the copyright date for the date of publication, and very straightforward, right? Done. In RDA, we have 5 ways we can do this. So you could say there is no date of publication on the resource, so I will say date of publication not identified. And that means that the copyright date becomes a core element, so you must also give the copyright date in a second 264. Library of Congress would say, use the copyright date as an indication, unless you have indication that it's really far off. use that as an estimate of the date of publication. So you could say, okay, it's copyright 2010. There's no other records for this in OCLC. I don't see any other indication that this book existed before. I'm going to say it was published in 2010. So I'm guessing, but I'm pretty sure, so I'm just going to use brackets around it with 2010. Perfectly good. And that's what Library of Congress would say to do. If you want to hedge your bets a little, and you say, well, how can I be sure it's 2010? Well, I'll say, okay, it's probably 2010. So you add a question mark. So that's perfectly valid as well. Now, even though you've added the supplied date of either bracket 2010 or bracket 2010 question mark, you are also free, of course, to record the copyright date that appears. So you have these other two options where you would be adding a second 264. Now, the Library of Congress would say that if you supplied the date, you fulfilled the core requirements, and they wouldn't also add the copyright date. But many catalogers have this notion that the copyright date is a different kind of thing than date of publication, and that it could be very useful in the future for people looking at works to know when they were copyrighted. So my practice is generally to record both when I have a copyright date. That's generally what I've been doing, even though it's going above the core requirement. Here's another interesting example. I'll go through this really quick. All you have is the printing date. And ACR2 allowed us to say subfield C in the 260, 2003 printing. Okay. Better to give, in RDA, we can say, okay, 2003 printing, that's all I know. It's the first printing from the information we have. So I'll say 2003 question mark in brackets. Or I could say something like, if I wanted to, I could say date of publication not identified, and then record the printing date in the 264 with the indicator 3 saying this is manufacturing date. The first option is much more appealing, to just say 2003 question mark and be done. There was an elaborate LCRI, for those of you who remember the LCRI that dealt with recording dates of publication and dates of printing and so on. There is a policy statement for instruction 2866 for items lacking a publication date, and I've only reproduced the very first little part of it on this slide just to give you a taste. So the basic practice is supply of date of publication if possible using the guidelines below rather than give date of publication not identified. And then there's a whole series of categories, A, B, C, and subcategories. So category A is if it only contains a copyright date, apply the following in the order listed. And the first one is to supply a date of publication that corresponds to the copyright date in square brackets, if it seems reasonable to assume that the date is a likely publication date. And then the second choice is if the copyright date is for the year following the year in which the publication is received, supply a publication date that corresponds to the copyright date. So around this time of year, we're in October now, we're getting a lot of copyright 2014 things, right? And so many people were wondering, well, isn't the date of publication 2013? And the Library of Congress says bracket 2014, not 2013, because 5 years from now, when you pick the book off the shelf, all it says in the book is copyright 2014, and no one will know that you received it 3 months before, or 6 months before, yeah. But that, you know, the book is very much likely to be cited in the scholarly literature as a 2014 book, because that's what appears in it. Even if it got, technically, you know that it got issued earlier than the copyright year. So it's a pragmatic response. And then there's a lot more cases in here, so I urge you to get a hold of this policy statement and keep it handy, because it covers a lot of different cases that are confusing about what to do.